Brother Josh and Elise Szwarga. Good to have them with us today. And he's going to present the work. And then right after the video, we'll take a few questions for the Szwargas. Thanks for being here, brother.
All right, in Sunday school, I had the opportunity to briefly give my wife and my own testimonies, how we trusted Christ, how we were called into missions. I do want to introduce my wife, Elise, and sitting there 4 rows back, and go ahead and wave at us, Elise. There you go. And we have our son Bentley in the nursery. He is 6 months old, and he is a joy to have traveling with us. How many of you have met Bentley already? All right, a couple of you. Good. All right. All the grandmas raised their hands, I noticed. So he smiled at you. There you go. He does have a love for grandmas, and they have a special place in his heart. So Bentley, I spent too much time on him already, I think, but he is a joy to have with us traveling. And we're headed to New Zealand, church planters. And that is going to be our ministry in New Zealand, is planting independent Baptist churches. I'm going to talk briefly just about the need in New Zealand, and because there is a great need. Before I do that, I will mention we have prayer cards on the table, since we're all looking at the table anyway. There's prayer cards, and then there's also coloring sheets. Make sure you get one of those. That'll be, I guess, for the kids and for Brother Josh Addy. And make sure you get one, and you'll enjoy coloring that and praying for New Zealand as you do it, and whatever gets you to pray for New Zealand. We do ask that you pray not only for our safety as we travel on the road, but also that we get to New Zealand in God's timing. And we're looking to get to New Zealand in May of this year, and we've been traveling for about 14 months now, and we're excited to potentially get there in May. God's given us about 85% of our support, and so that is our target. We ask that you do pray, though, for revival in New Zealand. And you're about to see in a minute in the video just how dark the situation is spiritually in New Zealand, how atheists they are. I believe it's in the top 5 in terms of the percent of atheists in the country. Many of the young people have never heard the gospel before. They don't know who Jesus is. And when you start to look at those numbers and you start to see how dark it is, I have hope. And how do you say you have hope? Well, when you look at New Zealand, you see a country that at one time was a Christian nation. They had great revivals like we've seen here in America. They had preachers preach over there that preached here. Men like Billy Graham early on in his ministry, Harry Ironside, R.A. Torrey, men that would hold revivals here in America that would see thousands saved, held the same revivals in New Zealand, saw thousands saved, saw churches planted for decade after decade. And then in the 1950s, the Word of God was removed from education. And that's really what's looked back on as the turning point for the country spiritually. When that happened, you had all of those revivals stop, all of the spiritual indicators, the churches being planted, all of that nosedived even faster than it has here in America. So you have a couple generations ahead of where we are here. You have the younger generations, about my age and younger, that are not atheists because they've rejected the gospel. They're atheists because they've never heard. They're atheists by default. And when you talk to that younger generation today, and not just when we were there on our 2-week trip, but the pastors that are there, the churches that were full of young people, they say that the young people are the ones that are open to the gospel, and it's simply the lack of knowledge of the gospel. And so that's a couple generations from where we are here in America. Those of you that might work with young people, maybe in the public education system, maybe you attend a public school, a teenager in here, and you know that there is an absence of the knowledge of God, and simply they need to hear the truth. And so we're optimistic that God can send revival. And I want you to take in your mind Mark chapter 6, you have the feeding of the 5,000, a miracle the disciples had never seen before. They were shocked that God could do it. And not only a few weeks later was the feeding of the 4,000. Now, a few weeks' time, you'd think the disciples would say, Lord, you've done it before. Certainly you can do it again. But in chapter 8, verse 4, they said, from whence can a man satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness? Because they failed to remember what Christ had done. They failed to see what Christ could do. So often with revival, we fail to see that God has done it before, and so God can do it again. My wife and I believe that God can send revival to New Zealand. He doesn't need us to get there to do it. All right, he could send it now. There are Christians there seeking it. Please pray with us that God would send revival to New Zealand. And we believe that spreading the light of the gospel, as it talks about 2 Corinthians chapter 4, is the key. Spreading the light of the gospel and having Christians seek revival. We're going to watch the video now. It's about 5.5 minutes, and that'll detail our ministry, the pastor we'll be working with over there, and our church planting efforts. Thank you so much, church, for letting us come, and have your questions ready for after the video.
The spiritual needs of New Zealand are great. 48% of Kiwis identify as non-religious, while 32% claim to know little or nothing about Christ. With a population of 5 million people, only 1% attend a gospel-preaching church. Young people have no interest in the traditionalism of the previous generation. In the midst of great natural life, there is tremendous spiritual death. It's evident that the youth of New Zealand are searching for a church with passion and purpose. Although there is a generation that has rejected religion, there is a generation that hasn't heard of Christ.
In 2006, at a revival service, I trusted Christ at the age of 9. 2 years later, during our missions conference, I answered God's call to the mission field. Although I didn't know where He would have me serve, it was clear that His will for my life would be an international ministry. During my final year of Bible college, my pastor returned from New Zealand and briefly spoke on the need for gospel-preaching churches. Through this simple comment, along with much prayer, the Lord burdened our hearts specifically for the people of New Zealand. In November 2019, we completed a survey trip on the North Island. The purpose of this trip was to confirm God's calling and to find a pastor to work with when we arrived. God allowed us to meet Pastor Dan Fraser of Grace Independent Baptist Church, who we plan to join in ministry with for our first few years.
I had the privilege of growing up at Faith Baptist Church in Posen, Illinois, under the leadership of Pastor Bill Stedman. While in the stillness of my parents' home around the age of 5, I realized I was a sinner and I trusted Christ as my Savior early that Tuesday morning. During my junior year of high school at a teen youth conference, the Lord put on my heart the idea of missions. I surrendered that week and told the Lord if that was His will, I was willing. The thing I didn't know was that my future husband was on a mission trip, praying the Lord would show him where He wanted him as a missionary. I followed the Lord's leading to Providence Baptist College, where I met my husband. We graduated in May of 2018 and got married shortly after that, June of 2018.
Ultimately, our goal is to see churches planted and pastored by nationals in the largest cities lacking gospel-preaching churches. Much like the United States, New Zealand was founded on Christian principles. In the mid-1800s, missionaries were some of the first European settlers. But by the mid-1950s, the decline of Christianity had begun, and now the majority identify as non-religious, mostly due to the younger generation.
The feel of New Zealand, a wonderful place, but we certainly need a soul-winning, separated, Bible-believing missionary there. And Josh is such a person. He and his wife are impeccable. They have gone through our ministries, never gave us one moment's trouble. They have worked diligently in the ministry and have done some good things for the Lord. Josh is on our staff now here at Northwest Bible Baptist Church, but surrender to New Zealand if you need a good missionary to New Zealand, a very needy place. Josh and Lisa is the people you want to support.
In a bay just like this one in 1814, Samuel Marsden sailed up and preached the first ever gospel message in New Zealand. It was Luke chapter 2 verse 10 about, "Fear not, for I bring you good tidings of peace toward all men." And after 20 years of hard labour, the gospel went out and brought a great harvest of many Māori people who came to Jesus Christ. But since those days, the settlers have come in, and though New Zealand was built on a solid foundation of Christian truth, we have sadly left that long ago. And now Māori people, the European people who came and moved here, all are in desperate need of the gospel, especially the younger generation. The time is ripe for them. They are now growing up in a way where they know nothing of God. They are hungry, they are searching, and we have an opportunity to share the gospel with them and bring them to Christ.
My name's Pastor Daniel Fraser. I'm from Grace Independent Baptist Church. I'm a national pastor here in New Zealand. I was reached for Christ by an American missionary by the name of Mike Rigney, who came to New Zealand and started our church in a city called Tauranga. And he led me to the Lord and then trained me in the ministry and handed the church on to me about 12 years ago, and I've been pastoring now for 12 years. And we're appreciative of the American missionaries that have came and started, and we want to continue that work. We have a lot of different types of churches, but very, very few fundamental Bible-believing Baptist churches that really preach the gospel and try to reach souls for Jesus Christ. We have cities down the coast on the east side there, Napier, Hastings, Gisborne around the corner, probably about 3 hours away. Again, no Bible preaching church.
God has given us 2 Corinthians 4:4-6 as confirmation of our calling. Although New Zealand is a very beautiful country, it is also a very spiritually dark country. Our desire is to help the pastors and missionaries already in New Zealand shine Christ's light in the darkness. We have the unique opportunity, just like those first missionaries, to bring the gospel to a generation that has never heard of Christ and give them their first opportunity to accept Him.
Please pray for the Szwarga family as they plant churches and preach the gospel to the people of New Zealand.
All right. If you would, what we'll do, Brother Josh, if you'd come up here and just take the pulpit in a moment. If you have a question for Brother Josh, just raise your hand and I'll call on you, and we'll try to get as many questions as we can here. So, come on, brother.
All right, questions. Don't everyone jump at once. Yes, sir, in the back. New Zealand's rated as actually the freest country in the world. I believe the U.S. is second or third on that list. And so when it comes to freedoms, both good and bad, that we view as Christians, it is a very free country. Freedom of speech has never been a problem. The current prime minister has indicated that she wants to crack down on churches, and she has said that specifically. She's very anti-God. She doesn't have the authority to do that right now. What's gone on the last 2 years has kind of given her more authority to go down that path. As of right now, there's no restrictions on churches, on going door to door, on street preaching, any of that. Obviously, like any country, it could come down the road, though. All right, any other questions? Not to end on a depressing note, but we do have freedom of speech. All right. Yes. Once we touch down, we'll be working with Pastor Fraser. Immigration requires that to be a 2-year period, and typically you're hired as an assistant pastor of some sort. He's hiring us as a church planter because their church is at the stage of being ready to plant a church themselves. And so we're looking to spearhead that effort with him. He's training members of his church to help us with that. And so within the first year or two, we would be looking to, of course, English speaking. We already know the language, but to acclimate to the culture, and then also to start a church. And that would probably be in a town about an hour away from their church. And ideally, we'd like to get to cities that are about 50, 60,000 in size and haven't had a good church in 50 years to preach the gospel to. All right, any other questions? Yes, sir. Yes, so typically we do send a prayer letter through email, and I know the church would be receiving those, but you can always sign up for that yourself. I send it to individuals if they ask, and then also on social media. You can look us up. Yep. Yes, ma'am. Yes, thank you for asking. So the visa, typically you would go in as a missionary, and you have to prove that you're converting people to your faith. Hopefully we'd be able to do that. So right now with COVID, conveniently that visa is closed. So one thing I do ask you to pray for, so this I guess would be our third prayer request for our ministry. There's a missionary right now that is looking to get into the country. They have their support raised. All they have to do is get in. And they submitted what's called a critical worker visa. So usually that's not used for missionaries, but if there's a company in New Zealand that says we cannot function without outside help, then they let them come in under that critical worker visa. And so a church over there said, well, we can't function without this guy coming to pastor us, basically. And so they submitted that visa. Please pray that that gets accepted, because if it does, we would do the same thing, and we would, Lord willing, get accepted under that as well. And so that's currently where we're at with the visa. Like I said, they're using COVID kind of to manipulate the rules a little bit, and so we're desiring a positive answer on that visa for the other couple. Any others? Thank you for reading our prayer letter, by the way. Yes, sir. On a day-to-day level, once we're in the country, there's really nothing the government is doing to hinder churches. And so on a day-to-day level, when you're dealing with people that have no knowledge of God, and we're doing the old-fashioned, we're doing soul winning, we're doing door knocking because it works there, just like it works everywhere else that you do it. And it would be, I want to phrase this correctly, connecting with the younger generation, to be able to give them the gospel. And I would say our biggest obstacle would be a lack of interest in the things of God. And so they're searching. There's definitely inside of them, there is that fire burning. They are looking for something like was already mentioned, with something with passion, something they can follow. And I would say it's tuning that and interesting them in the things of God. And that would be our greatest obstacle. More so than the government, more so than other religions. It'd be interesting that younger generation in the things of God. Yes, sir.
Two questions, Josh. One, what is the money exchange rate in America to their money? And two, is New Zealand part of Great Britain? What is it, a sovereign nation, or is it some other nation over?
New Zealand's exchange rate is about 71 US cents to the New Zealand dollar. They use dollars, just New Zealand dollars. And so if you're going to a coffee shop, just on a practical level, if the menu says $3 for the coffee, it's $2 US for the coffee. So that gives you an idea. And then it was a British colony up until early 1900s. And that's when they were given their independence. I was talking to some of the brothers about that before the service. That's important because that deals with their psychology today. The pastors have told me they're very laid back people. They're very go with the flow. They've never fought for their independence. It was just given to them. And so early 1900s, a lot of British roots, a lot of British culture, British accents you may have noticed in the video. And so we do have to acclimate to that British culture a little bit. We'll have to drink some tea, I guess. Yes, ma'am. When we went in 2019, this was pre-COVID, schools were open to go into, hold Bible studies. It wasn't being done very much, but our national pastor there was just talking about the opportunity to do that. You can go in and hold Bible studies. They were currently trying to get into one of the universities, one of the other national pastors, and hold Bible studies in there as well. We went and witnessed, passed out gospel tracts in the socialist university, like the hub, and every young person that we talked to was very open, willing to talk, just the professors that were not. And so that was encouraging. Open doors. Simply just have to take advantage of them when the Lord opens them up for you like that. All right, great set of questions this morning. Any others? Yes, sir. What was that? Not hard fast numbers. I could kind of divide those up into categories though. Promiscuity, very high, just because they, years ago, legalized a lot of that as forms of income. And let's see, some of those other ones, alcohol, I could not give you information on. We'd have to talk after the service if we looked it up, I guess. Things like murder rates, suicide rates, very low. Traditionally, you might see in the news, they just had a stabbing recently. They also had a shooting. So you see it in the news somewhat frequently if you're following New Zealand. It's very new. I mean, there was a girl murdered, I'd guess maybe 20 years ago, and that made national news for the year. I mean, that was like a big deal that a girl was murdered because it had been years since anybody was murdered. So the more godless they get, the more those vices come. Any others? And Pastor, just cut us off when we're getting close.
So I know, like in the video, it talked about the Maori people and
Yes.
the people of New Zealand. So it's kind of like they're categorizing two different people groups there. So what's that like? Can you kind of explain that?
You have about 15% that's Maori. The rest, generally speaking, is European descent. You have a lot of Asiatic countries that have immigrated there, a lot of Filipinos. So the churches we visited, it was a 33% split across the board, or it would be predominantly Filipino or predominantly European. So when it comes to the gospel, the Maori are very receptive to the gospel. Their religion is very animistic. They worship their ancestors. They worship nature. You can think of them like our Native Americans. They were the original people there. They have the same religion, same culture. Very open to the gospel. It's just a matter of breaking those ties from family that would hold them back, from separation, things like that. And then the European descent, of course, being predominant in the country. Culturally, they're integrated. They all live in the same neighborhoods. They work at the same places. They are very proud of their heritage, though. And so you see a lot of laws and things protecting the Maori heritage. I don't know if that gives you a good sense of what the country's like culturally. So, if not, see me after. Yes, sir.
The churches over there, are they like denominational wise, like Catholic, Protestant, Church of Christ, Church of God, like here, or is it something different?
30-something% is Anglican, and that was the predominant religion or predominant church throughout their history, obviously going back to British roots. It's very Catholic. For those of you that aren't familiar with Anglican, very Catholic, basically, is what it is. And then after that, it's very small percentages. Baptist Union was very big at one point. Thomas Spurgeon, Charles Spurgeon's son, had a church in Auckland, a tabernacle there. So nowadays, you have about, between both islands, 5 million people, you have about 25 independent Baptist churches. Not all of those are like our churches, but that gives you an idea of what the breakdown is. 2% Muslim. A lot of people think there's a lot of Muslims there. It's not really the case right now, 2% Muslim. It is the fastest growing religion there, which can be said across most countries in the world. So it's not too much different from that. All right, maybe one more? Yes, ma'am. I would guess young adults, primarily young adults, teenagers as well. The church that we're going to work in, their largest growing group or demographic is their youth group right now. The pastor recently told me it's just been very effective, on fire. A lot of teenagers bringing friends, bringing family members to church, bringing their parents. So that seems to be who's on fire right now, at least at the church we're going to. And we would most likely be reaching people in our age range. That's traditionally how it goes. So I would say younger 30s down to teenagers is who we would be working with mostly. At one point, they were using a program called King's Kids, which is what my church actually was using for some time. And Patch the Pirate Club, I know churches use that as well. They've used that before. Our church currently isn't using a curriculum like that. So I'm not sure where we would go with that route. All right. Pastor, thank you.
Ushers, if you would come, please, we'll receive